I got a PhD in applied physics. I did a lot of fluorescence microscopy over the years, some chemistry, and then I've, for, I don't know, 12, yeah, about 12 years now, have been working with people on projects related to visualizing lots of different things, everywhere from computational immunology to art history. And now I work in the libraries and help people from all over the university, the med side, with visualizing their data in various forms of visual communication. I'll go ahead and start sharing my slides. And as we're going, feel free to put questions in the chat. Angie's going to be monitoring for raised hands and things like that. I'm fine with questions during it. And also, you'll notice on the bottom of this intro slide, there's a link to a PDF of these slides. I'll show it at the end again, and we can pass around. We can put it on Sakai, so don't worry about it. But just know you don't have to take notes on all this. You'll be able to have a copy of the slides. So posters are a really interesting and challenging medium for communicating your work. Okay, they are an amazing opportunity in a lot of situations, because during a poster session, I know things are different right now. Posters are going to be viewed in a different way, but typically at a poster session, say at a conference, you will get the chance to speak to people from lots of different levels of academia and industry. Famous professors will walk around with their snacks and be looking at the posters. You'll get to talk to students, look at other people's posters. It's a great place for communication, but it's also a super challenging medium in that it combines graphic design, data visualization, storytelling, and it's not something we tend to be trained in. And I have lots of experience in this. Coming up through academia, I had to do lots of posters and I just didn't know where to start. So hopefully this will give you a little better feeling today, because there's nothing worse than sitting there in front of that blank canvas and kind of not knowing how to start or what to do, okay? So let's talk about first good posters. So good posters will have a focused, obvious, and short story. Okay, and we'll talk about this first. This is one of the toughest pieces. I think that that story should be clear from far away because of how people interact with posters. They're walking around with their snacks and drinks. They're looking from quite a distance, deciding who to walk up to. And, you know, it's always scary walking up to people, or it takes energy. So you want it to be clear from far away what your story is to draw people in. You need to limit the amount of text, because people are not going to invest a lot of time and energy to get that story. And that's one of the special things about posters as a medium. So to get limited text, you need to cut it down, and you also are going to need to turn some of it into graphics and images. And then the whole thing needs to have a clear organization and flow, which means plenty of white space, things like that. So this is an example of not a perfect poster, but I think a really good poster. This young woman, she happens to be a good designer. She has a very consistent look here. There's white space. Her messages are clear from far away. A nice use of color. So that's a great example. On the other hand, there's just lots of ways in which you can kind of go wrong in posters. And that's why I want to give you a good place to start. So bad posters might have too much detail or text, incoherent story, text lines that are too long or text that's too small. Generic section titles are very common, or no white space where everything's packed together because everyone's trying to fit everything in. Poor graphics, patterns behind text that make it hard to read, too many colors, no focal points or any hierarchy of information, and maybe accidentally emphasis on less important elements. So here's an example of a bad poster. And, you know, I don't mean anything personally against these authors, but, and this is maybe an especially bad one. Lots of colors, very busy. It's hard to know what to look at. Everything's smashed together. So this one may be especially bad, but unfortunately, when you walk around poster sessions, these types of problems are just super common. And so that's why I want to give you a few tips to start, okay? So let's start here. Again, this is maybe one of the hardest pieces, but posters should tell a specific short story, okay? And part of that means that's not everything that you might write up in a paper, something like that, that would have all the details. This is going to be just a section. So we say use shorter descriptive text, bullet points, short phrases. It doesn't have to all be full sentences, maybe even just 300 to 500 words for the entire poster. Now, what I'm showing you on the right here is a poster by a young woman who is just a really great designer and scientist. And I looked at this and read through it, and it's just beautiful. And it reads like a pamphlet. I understood everything, but I told her, here you still have too much text. There's repetition. So even with a beautiful poster like this, I had her go back and try to cut more down. Now, this quote is by the head of an infographics company instead of about posters, but I really love it here too. People get wrapped up in the process that they confuse the depth of detail they had to go through with the amount of detail other people are willing to go through to get the information, okay? So you did lots of hard work. You've researched a lot of things. You want that to be obvious, everything to be there, but other people are just not going to be willing to look at all those details. So you need, if you're going to get people to talk to you and understand your story, you need to cut it down. Now, when you're drafting your poster, you're trying to come up with how to put it together. One tip is to use a trick that I heard from someone else that was for putting together talks, but it works for posters as well. Take regular size Post-it notes and a big Sharpie. So you can't write very much on each Post-it, and go through a brainstorming session where you write down every idea that you would like to communicate, maybe on another color of Post-its, visuals that might go with it. Then you can go through weeding those out. You can start arranging them spatially, figuring out how you might tell this story before you ever get to any of the software, okay? Microsoft Word ends up being, or any sort of text editor like this, ends up being a good place to compile all of your content, partly because it's easier to edit here and you can look at it all as a whole and start getting the text down. You can paste in graphics that you're going to use. And then from here, you can put it into PowerPoint or whatever you're going to use to compile your poster. But think about, too, trying to do some sketching beforehand. This may especially come up with things like diagrams, where you're trying to explain certain concepts more quickly and easily without a bunch of text. But even if you don't feel like you're good at drawing, sketching out your poster, sketching out certain sections, trying to work out before you get to PowerPoint, any of the software, it'll save you lots of time. Even if you spend 10 minutes on a drawing and end up throwing it away, that's a lot better than that hour or 2 hours you would have spent trying to draft something in PowerPoint. So use the software at the end to just render your ideas as much as possible. Now, this picture happens to be from a special poster session that was held through the Regeneration Next initiative, where they warned people ahead of time, but everybody had 15 minutes to draw their poster. Okay, and that was the poster that they were going to present and everybody would look at. That sort of exercise really forces you to figure out what is important. How can you reduce the amount of information and still get your story across? So think about things like that as you're getting your poster together, and then just at the last part, put it all in PowerPoint and try to get it together. I mentioned that one of the important pieces of trying to reduce the amount of text is to replace text with visuals in a lot of situations. This happens to be just one panel from a bigger poster, where the researcher brought this to me, and it's lots of important information from the research she did, and the work she was doing was complicated. You read through all of that text on the left, and it takes a lot of energy to try to absorb it, and really it's more detailed than is needed for the quick time that people will spend with a poster. So in talking through it, we figured out that the graph on the chart on the upper right was important, some parts of the diagram, but she was able to go from this to this and really simplify the story, just decide on a few details that were really important to talk about this transition that the materials went through, where they injected it, and that's much easier to absorb. Now, people will bring me diagrams and say, I know this draft maybe isn't great. How can I make it a little bit more effective? And it would look like things like this, okay? So there's already been a lot of work that went into it. They have some decent arrangement. They're trying to get across some ideas about stages of a project and what some of the outcomes are. When I look at a diagram like this, often the main things I'm trying to do are, one, remove any what I would consider distracting elements so that people can pay more attention to just the content that's important. And then I also want to add some hierarchy of information. There's a lot going on here. Some of these things are more important than others. And so you need to make choices for what is boldest, what's biggest, what gathers attention first, and then what might be less important. So I looked at this and I said, okay, there's a fair amount of text. They're probably gonna have to cut a little bit of that down, but given that amount of text, one thing that's distracting for me is all the borders on the outsides of the shapes. Our eyes are really drawn to high contrast lines, but here, I don't want the attention to be on the outsides of the shapes. I want the attention to be on the content of the shapes. So we can get rid of the borders. There are various alignment problems. You know, there's some arrows and boxes that just aren't aligned with each other. Some things are overlapping. Part of this is just because it's a draft, but those little details, even if people don't notice them consciously, they'll get a slight sense of sloppiness or unprofessionalism or things that basically you don't want entering people's heads when maybe you want them to give you a job or grant money, or you want them to just think that you're doing really good quality work. You need to, at the end, go through and make sure all those little alignments are taken care of. Lastly, everything here has about the same amount of emphasis. You know, the gray column is a little different. So my mind says, oh, that must be the most important column because it's different than all the rest. And that wasn't really the case. And then none of the other boxes, there's some emphasis in size, which is good. But I decided, I played around, and it's not perfect, but I went from this to this, okay? I think it's a little bit more attractive, adding some color. It emphasizes the beginning and end a little bit more than the middle. The color coding kind of goes with some categories now of kind of inputs versus outputs. I got rid of all those borders, so I think it's easier to focus on the text itself. I bolded some pieces of text. I made some text gray, so it de-emphasizes it slightly. Something like those headers, some of the text that's inside of the arrows. And then lastly, I customized a couple little things. So even something like making the arrow the same color as the box, so it looks like it flows right out. That makes it look slightly more designed. Adding a little, you can change any shape in PowerPoint. So I just edited this arrow and made the bottom kind of scoop out. I can show you how to do that sometime if you want. But I think it makes it a stronger figure by just removing the distracting elements and adding a little bit of hierarchy here. Now, when I'm designing or when I'm kind of rendering my designs from scratch, I tend to use Adobe Illustrator because it allows me more control. Say I can put some things on a layer and lock it so I don't accidentally select them when I'm trying to edit other layers. I feel like it's easier to change the shape and make curved lines. If you want to learn how to use Illustrator, there's plenty of say LinkedIn Learning videos that are really great. I have a short workshop video that you can view on Adobe Illustrator for diagrams that'll kind of get you started. But really, PowerPoint also works fine for diagrams. Now, this one is, if the PI hadn't wanted this in PowerPoint, I would have advised to do it in Illustrator because it's so complicated. But you can see all this is a bunch of, you know, colored shapes, text boxes, lines. All of that can be done just fine in PowerPoint. I have another workshop video that you can view that it's called infographics in PowerPoint, but mainly it's more about shape manipulation and kind of PowerPoint skills for doing designs. Data visualization is one of the things I specialize in, and that's a great way to try to make a lot of information more visual, try to reveal the patterns more clearly to people within your, within your poster, within any of your diagrams and figures. When people are, I'm showing some variety of types of visualization here. Often people are asking me, what type of visualization should I use for this particular data? Or, I'm just using all bar charts, but I'm kind of bored with that. The thing is that classic visualization types are classic for a reason, and that's because they align really well with our perceptual abilities. So if we start off with data that's some sort of category and a number, like here I'm showing 3 different spaces within the library and their average temperature through the year, we're really good at comparing the length of bars that start at a common baseline. And so if you have that sort of data, a bar chart is a perfect place to start. You don't need to end up there, but it's a good starting point. You want to make sure all bar charts start at 0 though. Bar charts, we perceive the ratios of the bars, and so you need to start those at 0. If you have something like a date or a time plus a number, a line chart is a perfect place to start, because 1, we don't necessarily have to start at 0. 2, it really makes sense for lines to be connected when it's connecting dates, because time does exist between those 2 data points. Okay, you don't really want to connect categories with lines necessarily, because there's nothing really in between apples and oranges, but in between January and February, a line might be a reasonable approximation of what's going on. And then we can also fit a bunch of lines on and compare them easily. Finally, if you have 2 numbers that you're comparing to each other, and especially if you hear the word correlation coming out of your mouth, start with a scatter plot. We're really good at kind of even quantitatively judging the amount of correlation between two sets of numbers with scatter plots. Now, that's a starting point for some standard types, but I have 3 principles for data visualization that if you can apply them in a lot of situations, I think it'll get you about 80% of the way there. Okay, so if you can keep these in mind, first is keep it simple. On the left, I've got one of the Excel default pie charts, which happens to be a 3D pie chart. Okay, and the 3D nature is to make it eye-catching, which it does. It kind of attracts attention, so that's nice. The problem is it distorts the data. Okay, the principle behind a pie chart is that the area of the slices is proportional, or the arc is proportional to the data value. But here, when we're looking at this, even if we try to compensate, we can't help but see more orange than the other colors because of that slab that's sticking out of the screen. Okay, so keep it simple, just make 2D charts. Okay, 3D bar charts are also problematic because they're hard to do lookup on, and some bars may obscure others. So just stick with 2D. The second part of keep it simple is something you might not notice at first, which is this legend. Okay, it's very common for software to put legends on our pie charts, line charts, but you're already probably trying to explain something complicated to people. If they have to be jumping back and forth between the legend and the pie slices, or between the legend and your lines, that adds an extra cognitive load on the viewer that you just don't need to be there most of the time. So try whenever you can with your pies and your lines to just directly label the data and get rid of the legend. It'll just help it make it that much simpler. Now, the third thing I've done here is I've simplified the color scheme, and that kind of goes into my second principle, which is save color, don't waste it. Use color to draw attention to the story you're trying to tell. Okay, so on the left, we've got a perfectly fine bar chart. It's current Duke employment by generation. Got veterans, baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials. But the software by default has chosen 4 different colors for the 4 different categories. Now, the colors themselves are fine, but we don't need color to tell the bars apart because they're already separated in space. Okay, so why not save color to draw attention to the story that we're telling, which in this case was comparing millennials to the rest of the generation. As I manually colored in 3 of the bars with a neutral color. I used kind of a khaki or beige color. You more commonly use light gray. Some people say light gray for this reason is one of the most important colors in data visualization, okay? Then I pop my story with red, with something bold, really contrasty, to let people notice this is the story I'm trying to tell comparing to this to the others. The final principle is that story part. So every figure that you have in your paper, your poster, should have a purpose. And what I'm contending is that the purpose shouldn't just be to show the data. The purpose should be to tell, every figure should tell a story or at least make an argument as part of a larger story. Okay, so on the left, I've got a perfectly fine line chart, Duke hires by month, January through December for 6 different years. Okay, but the point of this figure wasn't so that people could compare, say, 2012 to 2013. It was to talk about this peak that happens in July. So on the right, you see I simplified the color scheme because people don't need to tell the years apart. And then I added some extra features to help draw people's attention and understand my story. So I added that gray line to draw people's attention to the peak. And then the annotation, hires always peak in July, which is the start of Duke's fiscal year. I think this tells the story more clearly. And some people hesitate with both this one and the previous one, with choices of annotations and colors, because as scientists, we're trained not to bias people, okay? And so we don't want to, we don't want to deceive people, but it's a lot of work to understand a story that we're looking at in a poster or a paper. And so everybody is going to be better off if you can help make it clear what that story is that you're telling as people go into the figure, okay? The people just don't have the energy to do exploration on their own. And I absolutely hate it when I go and I stand in front of a poster and I look at some figure, a graph or a table, and I say to myself, why am I looking at this? What are they trying to show? As long as you're giving people enough context, enough comparative data so that you're letting them make the important comparisons, go ahead and make your story obvious and everybody will be a lot happier. Remember, as you're getting figures ready for your poster, that the default sizes that come out of your software might not be legible at the size it's actually printed. So this is an example of a chart that came out of Qualtrics survey system. You can see the text is way too small on both the axes, but then the original questions were also worded they were very long. That was just part of how they were worded in the questionnaire. So one of my colleagues, when she went to present this, she did a couple important things, some of which we've already seen. She used red to highlight the topic that she wanted to show. She sorted the bars according to length. So before, it was really the pattern of highs and lows was really hidden in those bars jumping up and down. And the questions were probably just in the order they were asked or something like that, or alphabetical. It's not alphabetical. And so sorted the bars, used light gray for most of them, red for the ones she wanted to highlight. And then she also summarized the text. So it's much punchier. It's easier for people to just scan down and see what the topic is. And then she made the text all big enough to show at the size that it was printed. Often we have tables or diagrams that are full of numbers, and part of data visualization is trying to help people see those numbers comparatively much more clearly. This is an example of a chart from a research study where they were trying to take different cases of people that had been convicted of different things, but every box is kind of the same size. They all have this n equals. When I took this and made the circles or the containers proportional, the areas proportional to the number size, now you can much more clearly see how you went from a big population here down to really small at the bottom. Okay, so try to make those numbers visual to help people see the patterns. Tables are another just notorious place for patterns to hide. Okay, sometimes tables are a really great way to get across information, but we're just not good at keeping a bunch of numbers in our head and understanding the patterns in them, okay? So this is just copied and pasted out of someone's paper draft, and there's a few different problems with it that we want to fix. First is with the text. So a lot of the text, especially in the left-hand column, they have tried to make it look neat by doing what we call fully justifying it. So it's aligned on both the left and the right. Now it's supposed to make it nicer because it has more alignment, but really in practice, most of the time, all that does is add these big white gaps, which are ugly and distracting and make the text harder to read. Okay, so just left align your text. The other place that is really distracting and makes it hard is the grid lines. Okay, I talked before about how our eyes are really drawn to high contrast lines. And here again, we kind of see the grid and it's hard to see what's inside of the grid, which is what's important. So we need to do something about that. Finally, these last two columns are the ones that contain the numbers, which are the most important pieces here. And not only is it a little harder to see the patterns and how these two columns compare just with numbers printed out, they also have the comma, p equals, and what the p values were in there. Now, it's fine that the p-values are there. That gives us a little context for the statistical significance, but just there's a lot of visual confusion with all of those different elements. So I took this table and I pasted it into Excel and did a few things. And again, it's not perfect, but I think it's a big improvement. I went from this to this, okay? We've got fewer grid lines. Okay, so that's much cleaner. The grid lines that are left are gray rather than black, so they don't attract as much attention. Left align the text, so it's easier to read, no big white gaps anymore. And then I've made the patterns visual here by creating a bar chart. Now this was pretty easy in Excel. I was just able to use what they call conditional formatting, and it just made each cell into a bar so we can see the pattern. And then finally, I added some bold for the more important pieces. I left some text just regular, and then I turned some text gray when it was less important. So again, like in that diagram, I tried to create a little bit of hierarchy of information so our eyes get drawn to the more important piece of information. But remember, tables are just like any other figure. We can add annotations to them to help draw people's attention to what they should pay attention to, what our story is. So here we see highlighted the significantly impacted residents from this study. Now, I told you posters are this kind of amazing but tough combination of storytelling, visualization, and graphic design. And when I was starting out, the graphic design piece was one of the toughest for me because, you know, I could paste all of my elements in and try to rearrange them, but I didn't know any principles that I should be following to try to help me make it better. I knew that my posters could be better, but I didn't know what would help. And I kind of liken this to when, you know, I'm still not a good chess player, but when I first started playing chess, it was really easy for me to learn how the pieces moved. But when I tried to play a game, I didn't know anything about what strategies I should use, what might lead me to get better outcomes. So I'm going to try to really quickly give you an overview of some graphic design principles that I got from this, this book that sounds sort of silly, but it was really great. And I see lots of people recommending it, called the Non-Designer's Design Book. Okay. It's meant for, or it's written more towards page layout instead of posters, but the principles apply just the same. So I'm going to talk about her first four principles, which are proximity, alignment, repetition, and contrast. Okay. Proximity is just grouping related items together. And we see this, like on the left, we see this business card. The items are all there. We can read them all. But once we group like pieces of information together and use white space to help make those groupings, now we can read it much more clearly. We can group that information in our heads. This just goes with part of our perceptual systems. Our brains automatically associate things that are closer to each other and further relative to other pieces and to the borders of the design. So we need to use this white space to help people understand more quickly and to group. The second principle is alignment. What she says, and what I had some trouble absorbing this and really using it at first, but she says nothing should be placed on the page arbitrarily. Okay, so at the top we again see this, kind of just mixed up business card, nothing's aligned with each other. Once we center it or give it this right hand alignment, it's much more unified, it looks organized, it looks much more professional. It's hard though when you first start thinking about this, because it just seems like, oh, it might be nice to have playful design, things are, aligned wherever. It's always better when you align things to each other. And even when I first years ago was getting some of these slides together, I had this little reference at the bottom to her book. I had it just placed wherever. And I was looking through my slides. I was like, okay, I see that's not aligned. Oh, it's not going to make that much difference. But as soon as I moved it down and aligned it with everything else, now I looked at it and said, oh, no, that is actually better. Okay, so think about that when you're making anything, your tables, your figures, your entire poster. Centered alignment is fine, but it's more placid. Okay, that's why people use it for wedding invitations, things like that, because that's a nice, pleasant activity. Right or left alignment is much stronger and looks more professional, so try to use that more often. The third principle is repetition, and you're already probably doing some of this, but it's just consistency, but pushed a little bit further. So taking elements and reusing them, it not only unifies the piece, but it actually helps people understand your diagram or your poster more quickly. So when I look at this infographic, I'm learning how it's encoded as I go. I read the titles and then I see this part here with the one geophysical approach. Oh, okay, I see that's a header. So now I know that anytime I see a big red number and some text, that's going to be a header. And so I automatically know what this is. I see a question over this yellow question mark and I know, oh, that's how questions are presented. I know how to read it as I go down. Okay, so just try to keep some consistent elements and it will help people understand better. The final piece of this is contrast. And this is a really important one. It helps draw people's eyes to the important piece of information. We've already seen that a couple times with telling our story or trying to create some hierarchy. It draws people's eyes in, so it gives it more visual interest. And so we're going to try to use this in a lot of different ways. You can see here on the left, they have used some contrast by the titles in a different font. The headers are a bigger font, the body text, it all looks fine. But when you look at the example on the right, it's much more striking. The higher use of contrast is really helping draw our eye and add more visual interest. This is something that, as you know, this is a total overgeneralization, but I would say designers tend to be more brave in terms of higher contrast, using great big sizes, very small sizes. So try to stretch yourself with contrast. When we're doing this, we're using our visual systems, the strengths of our visual systems to help people read and understand more quickly. These contrast cues will help elements pop out in a fraction of a second. They're what we call pre-attentive visual attributes. So when there's a change in shape and color, size, orientation, weights of lines, positions, colors here, it pops out to us super quickly. The problem comes when we try to use too many of these at once. If we try to make too many changes in shape and size and weight, our systems get confused. The main time when I see this happening is when people are designing posters. It's hard to decide what's most important. Okay, like I said before, we've spent lots of time on every element. We think, okay, well, you know, my conclusions are super important, but well, the background's really important too, because if they don't understand the background, they won't understand the middle of it. Well, the methods are important because then it's reproducible. And you get into a state where you're not willing to make choices and you try to make everything bold but this is what you end up with, okay? You end up with these advertisements that are just, they hurt your eyes. Nothing has any emphasis because it's all been emphasized. And so you really need to make choices on what gets de-emphasized. This leads pretty well into, because this is painful to look at, to the next part, which is posters should be comfortable to read, okay? When you were looking at those advertisements a second ago, it's just, for me at least, it's a little visually painful. And I think that's one of the first principles of a poster. If it's uncomfortable for people to stand in front of your poster, there's no way they're gonna walk up to it and spend time talking to you about it and understanding it. Okay, so let's talk about a few aspects that'll make it more comfortable. The first is color usage. So when you look at professional designs, people that have been trained as designers, like these 3 infographics were made by a professional designer. One thing you'll notice that really sets them apart is they tend to really limit the use of color. And the color they do use, there'll be like one main shade or one main hue and black, and then they'll use lots of different shades. They hardly ever use pure black. They use the brightest part just for emphasis, and then lots of different grays. This helps to create some unity for the piece, helps you create that hierarchy, and just makes it look nicer. When we're trying to come up with color schemes for things like posters, there's sites like Adobe Color can help you with color schemes, but these days, every company you work for, every school you attend will have branding guides. They'll have design guidelines for things that come out of it. So this happens to be showing Duke's branding guide for color, but you can go to any school, any company, and they'll have something similar. This particular one shows not only Duke's 2 main blue colors, but it has what they call the extended palette, which is other colors that the designers use to go with those, still keep within the brand, but they've got a nice section of brighter colors for emphasis, a section of more muted colors that you can use for less important elements. I've been doing a lot of this lately when I try to revise people's posters or make my own. I'm using these colors as headers, as highlight lines, and it works pretty well. Sometimes you have to adjust the brightness of the colors a little bit to work in those situations, but use what designers have come up with for good schemes. Type is an area where it can be tricky in a few different ways. Try to use just one type family, one font family for your entire poster. I think there's ways to mix fonts, but it's a little bit tricky and sometimes they don't go well together. And within one family, even if you just have a regular and an italic and a bold and italic, that still gives you plenty of variations on the font when you combine it with different sizes and different colors. So you don't need multiple fonts to do your poster. Avoid all capitals except for just 1 or 2 words. It's just a little harder for us to read, especially big long pieces of all caps. So try to avoid that. And then we already talked about before, don't do fully justified, just left align your text. And then keep the text large. So say 22-point font, maybe it's the smallest you should go that would be comfortable to read at a few feet away where people are going to be sitting. So keep the text large and the lines short. It's tempting sometimes to put maybe your introduction spread across the entire poster. And what is hard for us is to read to the end of one of those lines and then know which line is the correct one when we jump back. Okay, so keep between say 45 to 75 characters per line. Shorter pieces of text will be easier. And then finally with type, text becomes really hard to read when the contrast is not good. And so if you're using light on dark or dark on light, that works just fine. But as soon as you get down to kind of middle ranges, it becomes very hard to read. And then especially when text is on top of any type of pattern. That includes images. So sometimes you might be tempted to put some background image to add some visual interest to your poster, but reading becomes hard over that text. And as you make that image lighter and lighter so the text becomes more readable, it gets to the point where you might as well not have it there. You know, go ahead and have images various places to draw people in, but just not behind your text. Another area of discomfort, like we saw in one of the first posters, is posters with no white space. And there are a couple reasons this happens. One is because you want to fit a lot of stuff on your poster. So you want to cram it in, and you get to the point where everything is shoved next to each other. It becomes hard to read. And to me, it also feels very confined. Okay, I get an uncomfortable feeling of kind of claustrophobia when I'm sitting there trying to read a poster where everything is smashed together. Another reason this happens, though, is because of the defaults in PowerPoint. So if you make a text box, the default is to have the text go almost entirely to the edge of the text box. And so you need to make those boxes narrower so there's space between them, or you need to go in, right click on them, go to the formatting settings and put some margins in there, some padding inside of the text box to make sure that the text isn't all running up against each other. With this poster, all we had to do, because the text was already big enough, is go from this to this. Get the boxes smaller. You can see it breathes a little bit. It's easier to tell where the sections start and end. We do this grouping between the headers and the rest of it because the white space is helping out. Now, one thing to be careful of, boxes and drawing lines between sections are not a substitute for white space. Okay, it does in some way help us know where the boundaries are, but it's still not easy to read. One of the more important pieces, I think, for me, almost right after keeping a short, focused story, is that your story, some part of your story should be clear from far away as people are wandering around the poster session. You see this all the time with things like newspapers. Okay, newspapers, people are gonna, when they're buying the regular paper newspaper, but even now when they're looking at it online, they're skimming through. What do you see? You see the titles, you get a little bit of information from that. So you see big titles here, but then you see a little subheading that gives a little bit more information. And then when you go in to read the story, they tell really important pieces up front, and then it gets to less and less important details. So you see it here, you see it in magazines like this one. You've got hyper-personalized medicine that just pops out, and then a little bit more information, still kind of big. Novel drugs are being designed to treat unique genetic mutations. Okay, we know what these stories are. If it's compelling, it draws us in. They know we're not going to read every story. You know that everyone is not going to walk up to every poster. But if you can try to tell part of your story through not only your title, but your headings, some other big pieces, that'll help draw people in and help them know what's going on. So this is a case where a poster draft came into me and we were looking at it. And so the first header, that's okay, but you get down and you're seeing fibroblast growth factor 21, glucagon-like peptide 1. Okay, those are descriptive in terms of what that section is about, but some compelling information was just sitting in these bullet points. And so she modified this first section so that we've still got this same main header, but now the subheaders tell more of a story. This growth factor recently identified as an important metabolic hormone. Okay, that's more compelling than just the name. This peptide enhances insulin secretion from the pancreas. That too helps get that story across. In another section, it was, instead of the background, it was figures where she had plots. Now, this is nice and descriptive at the top. Dual agonist outperforms this receptor agonist. But here again, the important details, the compelling pieces were buried in the bullet points down here. And so I would look at these figures, and even though she had actually done a good job with her colors, I knew probably what she wanted me to pay attention to. I didn't know whether high or low was good, what was going on, what each of these was proving. And so she took that stuff out of the bullet points, simplified it a bit. It's a little bit long pieces of text, but look at what it says. This agonist treated group responds to glucose spike more efficiently than an equimolar dose of this other thing. Okay, now I look at this figure and I know what she's telling about, and I can see how good I think her evidence is with all of these different figures. Finally, with this part, I think not only should you have a clear title that shows something and some headers, but try to have maybe a motivation and a takeaway bold and clear from far away. I'm going to zoom in on a couple of these pieces. You can see here, though, these big colored blocks attract your attention. If you look at them closely, they talk about the motivation, how do the qualities of memories and fiction compare to memories of lived experience? And then in the final one, she talks about what they found. And so people can look at this even without reading the details and have some sort of takeaway that maybe even they can get something out of from far away without even having to walk up. Now, this idea has been popularized lately with what they call better posters, okay? What I tend to call big message posters. Now, some of you have probably seen this YouTube video. Mike Morrison made this great animated 20-minute video contending that science is actually not progressing as fast as it could be because of the fact that most of our scientific posters are broken, okay? They're hard to read. It's hard to know what the takeaways are. People wander through a poster session and they don't even know what's going on in their field because the posters are hard to get information from. So what he talks about is making a format that has a great big main finding right in the middle. Then you have some like introductory material, all of your figures smaller along the sides. You can point out to people. I think the motivation behind this is incredibly important. I think posters are broken, okay? I think it's very important for you and for any scientist to figure out what is the point of your poster? What's the big takeaway? What do you want people to walk away from? I think there are ways of incorporating that into it that are a little bit more graphical than this and that balance out the sizes of these elements. So I'm glad these experiments are happening. They're doing whole poster sessions that are using this format and trying to do studies with it. I'll show you, we'll see some examples as we go through the critique session that I don't think you have to go to quite this extreme. If you want to see some other discussions about this format, someone that came up with another template they call butter posters, which is just a play on words. Their next, and then they have, from using those, they have some other thoughts, and other people have talked about this. I tend to generally not advocate for people using templates for their posters, because I feel like a poster is some pretty simple elements. It's some pieces of text of different sizes. It's not that hard to create it. And I feel like templates tend to lead people to try to fit their content into some sort of arrangement that will work for some people and not for others. And I really want you to adapt your content to, how it should be balanced. How much space should you take for your results versus your introductory material? But when someone really pushed me to come up with a template, this is the type of thing that I personally would use as a template. It's just done fairly quickly in PowerPoint. It's got some bigger, easy to read text that tells part of the story. It's got the names and affiliations. It's got a big colorful section that is the motivations, why should we care, a couple of takeaways, and then headers that hopefully say something more than just introduction and conclusion, and then maybe some subheaders and space for the content, plus plenty of white space, and then just a reasonable layout that it's easy for people to follow. Okay, so if you want a copy of this, I can send you a copy of this, but I feel like this is about as much template as you should need. Okay, so I know that was a lot of stuff, but it really boils down to just a few pieces here. So I want you in your poster to try to tell just a single short story. And that unfortunately may just be part of your story. If you were going to write a research paper, you may have a lot more details, multiple stories. You really need to boil it down to something simple to absorb in just a few minutes. You want to minimize the text, which means cutting it down and converting some of it to visuals. The main story should be obvious from far away, and that comes from using active titles, having some hierarchy of information and through your use of contrast, and then leave some white space. So it helps people group items together. It's comfortable to look at and read and know what the flow is, and then limit colors and fonts because that'll make it a little more clear and unified and easier to look at. All right. So the
Eric,
final,
can I
yes,
break in here?
you bet.
Thanks. This is all great. We have one question that popped up in the chat that is, what application or site would you recommend for poster creation? I know that you talked just a moment ago about PowerPoint templates, but are there other options too?
I don't have, I can probably dig up a couple of links to other templates, but the way I end up dealing with posters is a little bit more just like this, where I think it's more about trying to cut down your story to a coherent story, trying to lay something out that just, you know, it's more about the graphic design and the storytelling instead of about the application. And I tend to just use PowerPoint and just create the text boxes and stuff, or start from something like this that has a couple of pre-made text boxes so I don't have to do the sizing myself. But I don't have a lot of links for like great things to just fit your content into. It's partly just a personal conviction that I feel like I've seen too many posters that end up really bad when you are just following this, but I'm perfectly happy to say, send you this template and let people play around with it.
I should say here that we did give templates, or we have templates on the Sakai site for the program, but we've given this caveat of you don't have to use this. It's more of a kind of a comfort.
And it does help. Like I've worked with Fast Connections to try to come up with some alternatives to their templates that that go along with my guidelines, and it's fine when they're templates. I don't mean to come down on it too hard, but I want people to try to figure out what's the best way to tell their story rather than feeling like it needs to fit into a certain template as far as layout and stuff. If you want consistent colors and sizing and things like that, you know, I think that's just fine.
One more question.
Yeah.
And that is it a problem to have small margins?
I think it's a little bit of a problem for readability and for comfort of looking at it. Either small margins on the outside, like you want to make sure when you go to the printer, usually the printer itself will have some margin that needs to keep on the side. It might be minimal, just like a ½ inch or something, but I try to come in, you know, at least an inch on the sides and then have a couple inches in between my columns, just for ease of visual ease of grouping and comfort in reading. But on the very outside, it is partly about making sure nothing gets cut off if their printers don't go all the way to the edge. All right, so with the last piece here, I do not see the chat right now. Let me see if I can find, no, why I can't see, oh, more, it's probably in there. Okay, so I'm gonna get the chat up here so I can see it too, but what we're gonna do is do a critique of at least one poster here as a group. Okay, then I'll show you another example. And what, partly this is a process that I'm teaching you, and partly I want you to see how we can do a lot with a draft of a poster where it's not complete, and get to a better spot, and then a couple of alternatives for designs, because I've got some reworks on these so you can see from the beginning to the end. So a critique session or run in a specific way, and you can do this just with each other, with your own posters, or this is the type of thing that I could go through with you. We always start off with what's good, okay? What is working well? What do you like? This is partly because people have already sunk a bunch of time in this. Even everybody's crappy first draft, that may have taken them 6 or 10 hours to get to that. Okay, so you want to be aware of that. Also, though, I want you to practice being able to specifically articulate what is good about posters you see. So when you see a good poster, you don't just say to yourself, oh, that's really nice. you're able to identify and articulate, oh, it's good because of their use of colors or sizes or margins, something like that, so you can use it in your own work. After we've gone through the positive things, then I will tell you, we'll specifically switch over to what's not working as well, what is less effective than it could be, and what are some ideas for what might make it better, okay? Also, this first poster, so I'm going to show you a poster, and again, this is just a draft. Someone came to me, she had done most of the layout, but there, you'll see some sections are blank. That's fine. She just wasn't all the way to the end. It's actually a great time to get some feedback, because at the early stage, you're still willing to make some changes. After you've spent 30 hours tweaking around all of your little boxes, if I tell you something isn't working as well as it could be, you're not going to want to change it. Okay. Or if you wait too close to the deadline, you're not going to want to change it. Okay. So early stages are the best. All right. So we'll look at this and then go ahead and put in the chat and we'll see how this works. We'll do our best with this. What's working well? What do you like about it? And it can be even simple things. All right. So take a second. Anything that comes to mind that you think is working fine with this or that you like? And if you're more comfortable just speaking up, I'm also fine with you just unmuting yourself and talking. And also, I can wait for a long time. We can just sit here. Okay, the headings stand out well. Yeah, so it's easy to see where the headings are, what they are. Yeah, sections are clearly marked, so it's really easy to tell where those sections are. Spacing is pretty good. She does have some spacing between her columns, between the sections, so that's good. It's not a lot of color, which looks professional. Yep, I agree. She's limited her colors so it doesn't look too busy. Use of figures for results rather than writing it all out. Yep, really good. So there's some diagrams, some images, some data visualization, some other images that helps get across changing some text to visuals. Sticks to the color blue, which is easy to read. Graphics seem pretty easy to follow and pop out well. Yeah, so there's lots of good things. Consistency with headers, legible text used, visual aids that are easy to read. Very simple, gets the point across. Yep, I think all of these things are good points. She has not tried to shove too much into this poster. She's used some visuals. She has a consistent, she's used repetition. She's used spacing and alignment. So there's a lot of good things going on here. I think she's really thought about her flow and her story. So yep, those are all good pieces. Let's move on then to, good job with that. Let's move on to, what do you think is not working as well as it could be? And what are some ideas for things that might make it more effective? Diagram in the first section is a bit small and cramped. Yep, I think that's right. So this diagram here is, it looks like it's probably pretty important, it has a lot of details, but it's made really small. It's a little hard to read. It's probably not getting the points across quite as well as it could. Maybe change the headers to main points derived from the section. Yeah, so the header text that she used is very generic right now. Background, results, method. It's hard to get the story from far away with the way she's done. She's tried to do a couple of things by having some subheaders, but I think she can do better than that. Yep, section heads could be more descriptive. There's a lot of white space. Yeah, some of this is because it's not quite done. So she'll fill in other parts. Let's see, generally increasing the size of the fonts. There are some pretty small fonts in some spaces. I think when this is printed at its final size, some of the text is fine, but there probably are a couple of too small text. No main takeaways from afar. Yep, that's a good one. Method section can be edited a little with the most essential parts of the methods. Yeah, so right now she's got a lot of details here. In this case, I think it was part of it was for a summer project, so she needed to show what methods she learned, and so she's probably going to show a little bit more detail because of that. But yeah, that potentially could be edited out. There's often a lot of methods detailed that people aren't going to care about. And you can have things like handouts with you that have more detail about some of the methods or parts of the story for those people, or you can have a QR code or some other URL that they can go for more detail. Let's see. Titles may lose key points, interest in the bullet points, no clear emphasis on what's going on. Make research questions and stand out more or designate a section for it. Yeah, so here she's got some motivation, but it's a little, it's not really standing out quite as much as it could. Either too busy or too empty in places. The motivations, takeaways could be more clear or compelling. Yeah, I think especially the takeaways are, you know, I know she's not done with future directions, but I think from the results and the takeaways, that's not really clear yet. Yep, maybe include a takeaway section to better emphasize what was discovered and what the purpose of the study was. Yep, I think these are all really good points. When I looked at it, a couple of other things popped out in addition to the points you're bringing up. There's some stuff like maybe the title is a little bit small. Let's see, make the bottom left graphic larger. Yeah, definitely that could be larger. The title is a little small compared to the rest, so there's a little bit of a balance there. I'm not, I don't really like centered titles. I think centered text is fine when it's just a tiny bit, but reading a line and then having the next lines come down, not starting at the same spot, makes it harder to read. So I tend to want people to left align their titles when there are multiple lines. You know, there's some things like, you know, she's got some overlapping text and numbers here from her plots, but that's pretty obvious. One thing that I want to point out from this one, though, that to me is a big deal. Remember when we were looking at the tables and all the grid lines were distracting, things like that? Here, I feel like what's distracting is the really big blocks of color for the headers. Okay, it makes them very noticeable. It adds color to the poster. So that's true, but the section headers should just be descriptive and help us know where the sections are and what they're going to be about. They are not usually the most important piece of information. And so I feel like these big blocks of color actually draw my eye too much. It also forces you to make your header text a little smaller because you want a little band of color on the top and bottom as well. So if you get rid of those blocks, you can actually increase the font size a little bit more. So I made a variation on this. I think I've included this, yeah, where all I did is kind of change those headers from the blue to something that is just colored differently. Okay, so if you go back and forth, you can see in some ways it looks a little bit less colorful, but that's going to allow us to emphasize other pieces, and it actually let me make the header text a little bit bigger. Okay. The other things that we came up with were that, like, these methods, even though she tried to make this a little bit visual, it turns out that, like, the first column of methods went with this first section of results, the second column went with the second results. So we realized she could reorganize some of that. In her original, the acknowledgements and the references are really big. Okay, it's important to have some of these things, at least the acknowledgements, but you can make them much smaller. They don't need to be comfortably read from far away. And references actually don't always need to be there. It varies a little bit. Sometimes you need them, but they can be very tiny as long as they're there. So, okay, so we made a little change here. She took the advice and went from this to this one. Okay, I think it's much more clear. You can see that the title is left aligned. It's easier to read. Her name is a little bigger. I've de-emphasized, or, you know, I've kind of helped her de-emphasize the icons from the organizations. They shouldn't be the most important thing. Diagram is bigger, more clear. Now she has these headers that tell part of the story. So it still says background, but you have, what is melanocytoma? What mediates its dissemination? How might we stop it? Okay, so her motivation is stated out right in the subheaders there. Then in the results, you know, these kill patient-derived MC cells. This decreases the mix expression before the cells die. That's clear. The methods are associated with these figures. And now look at this. She has this big bolded colored section, what this means. These are the takeaways. And then she has future directions after that. So it's still a nice limited story, but it's organized in a way and has so much description that people can get the story more easily from far away. All right, the last one, just for a matter of time, I'm just gonna go through and point out some things. This is the draft, and she was trying to follow this kind of better posters idea where she has a big takeaway in the middle. And I love that she's trying to emphasize the takeaway, okay? Undergraduates receiving integrated academic and advising support show increased rates of thesis completion. That's important, that's what they found, okay? But I felt like that was overemphasized with respect to some of the other figures and things that were important, some of the background. There was, you know, a couple of issues with, you know, the stuff on the sides is just getting too small. So in the first round, she changed the emphasis by still having this big takeaway. You know, it's still there, it's still big, it's still noticeable, but she has a little smaller. She was able to make the figures bigger, add some headers, creating a new model for integrated thesis support. And then she added this motivation statement. It's not as bold, but it's right there in the upper left. Students start writing a thesis, but don't always complete it, okay? So this was a good, good strong rework. There was still a little bit of weird stuff. The template here had this gray section for the affiliation, and I thought that gave it a strange alignment and didn't really add much. So parts of her diagram, her chart were still a little small and hard to read. So we went from this to this, and I think the title is more clear. We got rid of that gray box. It's easier to read her figure. And then the final thing I want to show you is something that is, for me, is kind of a pet peeve, but I think it's because it makes it easier to read. In her original, and this is because of the PowerPoint defaults to the same spacing between lines as between bullets. So the bullet is there to tell me where the bullet point starts, but I have to kind of do a little extra work to tell where the bullet points end. So you can rework that. If you go into the paragraph formatting, you can put a little before or after spacing for your paragraphs. And now we have much easier groupings on these bullet points. And I know it's a small point, but a lot of these changes are just the accumulation of lots of small changes that each make it slightly easier to read, slightly more effective, and then in the end make a stronger poster that looks more professional, and people will be more willing to walk up to you and talk to you about it. Just want to finish out telling you about the department I work in. So we're the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences. There's 7 of us. You can see our website URL. We work in 5 different support areas. So we help people find published data sources like census data, things like that. We do some data science like R and Python and data cleaning and transformations. Not a lot of heavy analysis because that's more field specific, but a lot of other data work. We have 2 specialists in mapping and geographic information systems. We have 2 specialists in data management who can help you from beginning to end in research projects, from proposals where you need a data management plan to the end where you need to share your data with other people and store it and make it accessible. And then in the middle, how to collaborate, how to name your files, how to do a lot of those things that are part of research projects. And then my specialty is data visualization. When I'm helping people with visualization, it will be things like listening to the story you're trying to tell, looking at your data, helping you brainstorm about what sorts of visual representations might work well, maybe recommending tools or helping you troubleshoot those tools, helping cleaning and restructuring data so it's ready for analysis or visualization. And then some of the stuff we've been talking about at the end today, I'm not a graphic designer, but I've done this for a lot of years. So people will bring me their drafts of their figures or their posters or their slides, and we'll talk through it. And I try to help them make it better. We do have videos of, we're not holding live workshops right now. In the fall, we'll start with remote workshops like this, but we have videos of a lot of our past workshops at bit.ly, big DVS little videos. You can look through that. But in the end, if you have any questions about this stuff we've been talking about today or any other data related stuff, we've got this one central email address, askdata@duke.edu. Just pop us an email and then we'll do our best to help. And again, you see the PDF of the slides is at this URL at the end. So thanks for being here. And if you have any questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat or unmute yourself and we can talk about it.
We can give a little bit of time for questions, but in the meantime, thank you so much for coming today and
You're welcome.
kind of sharing this information. Just so everybody knows, this session has been recorded if you want to go back to parts of it, and we will post the slide set in the Sakai site also.
Cool. All right, for posters, what do you think about graphics generated in R by a package like Dplyr? I think that's fine. Graphics for posters can be generated in, I'll do them in, I don't tend to use R just because I don't know R, but I'll do Python or MATLAB or Tableau or Excel or, Illustrator. They can be generated a lot of different places. What you want to do though is output in a format that's a vector format often. So it's like a PDF. If you can bring a PDF into your PowerPoint, or if you're on Windows, if you copy and then you paste, I think it's called a meta file, it'll keep it as vectors and you can then stretch it and shrink it to any size and the lines will still stay sharp because they're just mathematically defined as the outlines of the text and everything. If it's pixels like a PNG or JPEG or something, you just need to make sure that all of your graphics that are output are at least 300 pixels per inch at the final size they're going to be printed. So if it's going to end up 10 inches wide, it needs to be at least 3,000 pixels across to stay sharp when it's printed. But yeah, if you have questions about any of that, or if you have trouble getting things into your poster and having it stay sharp, just let me know. But yeah, you want to make sure you're not just doing screen captures of things and putting them in your poster, because usually then you blow them up and print it and it looks blurry.
That might be it for the questions.
All right. Well, good luck, everybody. And let me know if, oh, one last question. Is there a way for students to get easy access to Illustrator? Duke students, there is. I don't know where you're a student. If you're a Duke student, you can get free access to the whole Adobe Creative Cloud suite of applications, so that you can. If you don't have that, I think they have student discounts, but it's so it's cheaper, but it's still a little bit expensive. There are Illustrator alternatives for both Windows and Mac, so I can talk to you about those if you want. But then for a lot of things, PowerPoint works just fine. It just depends on kind of the complexity of what you're trying to create.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. And good luck, everybody.